Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the newest album from Kenny Chesney, titled The Big Revival. So okay, if you've been listening to country music beyond just the past year or two, you've probably noticed that certain acts tend to take their party/relaxation songs to the beach or to the Caribbean. It's lightweight, it's generally pretty harmless, and occasionally can be a fair amount of fun, especially if you get acts like the Zac Brown Band or Jake Owen. Now then again, both these acts have realized that it isn't exactly a good thing to spend too much time at the beach, which is why Jake Owen's most recent single is an acoustic ballad, and a really good one too, and the Zac Brown Band are currently recording with Dave Grohl. But occasionally you run into acts in country music that don't ever seem to really leave the beach, and undoubtedly the most popular of these acts is Kenny Chesney. Now he might have started out in neo-traditional country way back in the 90s, but in the very early 2000s he found a niche in the lightweight country that seemed to be destined to be played in all-inclusive resorts and cruise lines. And to his credit, that niche fit him pretty damn well, and he and his arsenal of co-writers have produced a fair number of pretty good songs, some of which I actually like and are pretty fun. But as the decade wore on, more astute listeners came to realize that the beach for Kenny Chesney became less of a lane and more of a crutch, especially as they pumped out album after album of material that all started to sound pretty similar. Sure, he'd occasionally drop a more interesting collaboration, or he'd switch it up and add some reggae, or strike a more melancholy pose, but in the 14 albums released across the 2 decades of his career, about 8 or 9 of them were firmly lodged at the beach. Kenny Chesney so thoroughly dropped himself into the Jimmy Buffett mold that there were many accusations made that he ripped Jimmy Buffett off. But I'd argue that's not quite fair. As much as Jimmy Buffett has written some pretty damn asinine songs, he wasn't afraid to be loose and silly and weird, and occasionally he did write some stellar songs that I do love. Kenny Chesney to me has always seemed like a little bit more of a workman with a little bit more dignity behind him. He put out some accessible, middle-brow, solid enough albums with plenty of songs that would ultimately miss the point of Margaritaville, but Kenny Chesney's never going to write a song like A Pirate Looks at 40 or conversely A Cheeseburger in Paradise. And that means that honestly as an artist, I've never really been all that interested in him. Now that said, Kenny Chesney's newest single, American Kids, did seem like a bit of a departure for the guy, and while he only has 4 writing credits on this album, he is working with some of the better songwriters in Nashville right now, so I figured, what the hell, and I gave The Big Revival something of a chance. What'd I find? Well, it depends on what you're expecting, because at the end of the day, it's a Kenny Chesney album, and a massive chunk of this record is devoted to getting sloshed at the beach and keeping that breezy, upbeat, good time tone. And if you're going into the album for just that, as many listeners are, yeah, okay, you're gonna get it. But at the same time, there is some stuff on the edges of this record that does deserve a fair amount of deeper scrutiny, both for good reasons and for bad reasons. So okay, let's start with Kenny Chesney himself. And look, just like Tim McGraw, I completely get why Kenny Chesney has stuck around as long as he has in the mainstream. His voice is warm, it's generally pleasant, and it's got enough broad, emotional expressiveness to really work for his material. Of course, it generally helps matters that the songs on this record don't exactly require a huge amount of emotional range or massive investment, but Kenny Chesney does have enough charisma to make kicking back with the moonshine and the beer can chicken. No, I'm not kidding about that. On a beach somewhere, he makes it seem relaxing and kind of fun. And it's definitely good to see very little, if any, traces of pitch correction on Kenny Chesney's voice, because it definitely wouldn't fit the ramshackle, lowbrow atmosphere of this record. And that's one thing that did surprise me about this album in a good way. The instrumentation actually has a fair bit of a pulse and some real texture, especially in the guitar work. Now, sure, it's a little bit more polished than I normally like to see in country music, and the guitars are mostly lodged in the upper end of the mix and don't exactly deliver any melodies that I would consider all that special or unique or really stuck with me. But there are a few high points that I like. I kind of like the melody Until It's Gone, the acoustic vibe on Wild Child featuring Grace Potter doing a pretty good job, and on the song Donut, which I liked, the breezy, lightweight feel of Beer Can Chicken that mostly keeps the heavier guitars behind the acoustic strumming, which is probably the best possible choice for that kind of song, and the simple but pretty effective piano melody on If This Bus Could Talk. Now, none of it's aiming to be all that substantial, and on that note, it mostly succeeds, but there are a few issues that I noted. For instance, the lead-off single American Kids does feature a lot of high-end textured acoustic strumming and the banjo and backing shouts that recall a lot of the folk leanings that have colored other Shane McAnally written tunes. So why the hell is there a drum machine on this track for the low end? The worst song on this album in terms of instrumentally is probably Rock Bottom, which might feature some decent guitar snarl, but also features some of the worst horn presets I have ever heard, which is a real shame because that song does attempt some more of a heavier edge that kind of worked, and that completely manages to undercut it. But then again, some of that heaviness might be pretty misplaced on an upbeat party album, which takes us to lyrics and, you know what, look. At some point, you need to throw up your hands and walk away because the songwriting is really thin on this album. I'll give Kenny Chesney's songwriters this: they can occasionally provide a pretty impressive level of detail in order to set the scene, like on American Kids, Don't It, and If This Bus Could Talk, but for the most part, it's all setting detail. It's all window dressing around the central conceit of hanging out and partying and having a good time. And that can make many of the tracks seem pretty shallow, all things considered. Now, granted, it's hard to judge a shallow party song for being just that, but without any real gripping melodies or intriguing lyrics or anything close to a real story behind the song, many of the tracks feel like just rote checklist of various country-affiliated stuff, and I'm sorry, that just does not stick with me on an emotional level. I had the same complaint for Bro Country, and I'll say it here. Now, there are some points that I will stress that it can kind of work. If This Bus Could Talk retraces Kenny Chesney's path to stardom, and it's got some pretty solid emotional weight behind it, even if some of the resonance is kind of sidelined by the very silly image of a talking bus. And Wild Child, it's not a bad song either. Sure, the qualifiers of this girl running wild are based upon pretty standard modern hippie and hipster tropes like unrecognizable music that she listens to unless you've been to Bonnaroo or Burning Man. But like Danielle Bradbury's song Wild Boy, it's at least self-aware enough to know that any relationships with this wild girl probably won't last, and that's probably a good thing. But there's a larger issue with this album lyrically, and that's in the framing of some of the more ambitious songs, how they look from the outside perspective. Now, American Kids is probably the best example. It tries to paint a very realistic, textured picture of the normality of these kids' lives and how it isn't all sunshine and daisies and that there's real problems there, but that same upbeat spirit prevents the song from really saying anything or going above just pure populism for everyone to sing along with. And it's not within spitting distance of similar tracks like Merry-Go-Round by Casey Musgraves that actually had something to say about those American kids and packed more of an emotional punch. Or take Save It for a Rainy Day, a song where Kenny Chesney gets dumped and would like to process his emotions, but hey, everyone's out in the dock and there's cold beer and you just can't think about those sort of things now and today. Save it for a rainy day. Now compare this song to Life of the Party by Jake Owen, where there's some actual emotional stakes behind it because Jake Owen is still in very real pain over the breakup and he's forcing himself to be the life of the party to stop himself from thinking about it and really dwelling on it. But there's no stakes in the Kenny Chesney song and thus I just can't get emotionally invested in it. And that's before we get to the framing on the real duds of this album. Rock Bottom describes the narrator drinking himself into an absolute hole because of a breakup, but he's suddenly feeling okay because he's got a new girl from California and he's already bounced back with the right track, and it just feels so weightless, it's not even funny. And that's not touching on the opening title track, by far the song that does not belong on this record or any Kenny Chesney record under any circumstances. A song about snake handling in church that glorifies the practice. Now, for my non-American viewers, snake handling is a process that's been outlawed in most sane states of the Union, by which rattlesnakes and vipers are held in church, often by the pastor and believers, and it's a sign of your faith by which you could hold such a snake and not get bitten. Now, those who have gotten bitten and died, and by today's count it's over 70 people, although that number is a little bit difficult to verify, they're simply described as it's being their time to die. Now, I'm a Catholic, and I believe in an interpretation of certain biblical teachings as metaphorical as described by scholars, and that Jesus was a pretty smart dude who expressed that people should use some goddamn common sense in the modern age. Now, it's somewhat debatable how much Kenny Chesney is glorifying this practice. That's a matter of interpreting tone, and there are points where you can make the argument that he's kind of winking at the audience, which is a little insulting in its own way. But when you have a chorus that prominently features the lyric, "Praise the Lord and pass me a copperhead," and you're a songwriter who filled the rest of his album with songs about beer can chickens and laying back and kicking back and partying, you're in way over your head. I'm sorry. This isn't like Brad Paisley's Those Crazy Christians, which at least tried for a nuanced picture. There isn't nuance on this record. I'm sorry. So putting that song aside, this album is the sort of record that many people would easily describe as critic-proof. It's shallow, beach-friendly party music, and there's a limit to how much of it you can take all that seriously. But you know what? That was the same defense that was used for a lot of bad bro country, and I've always maintained that there's a standard of quality to this, even to good party music. And considering that Kenny Chesney has churned out 14 albums over the course of the last 20 years, and the majority of them have been in this vein. I've seen this done before, and I've heard it done better from him. And combined with the other real issues on this album, it's a strong 5 out of 10 and only recommendation if you need your standard dose of Kenny Chesney. And while it might be a more consistent album than his pseudo-reggae experiment last year, The Big Revival as a record does not impress me. And it might be a sign that I was way too hard on Brad Paisley and Jake Owen. They might be making some shallow party songs on occasion, but there's more to them than on this album. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I didn't realize I'd have this much to say about a Kenny Chesney record, but hey, it happens. If there's anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation or any other albums coming out that you want me to take a look at, I'd be more than happy to give them a listen. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.